And this is a joint meeting, a partnership between the Institute for Public Policy Research and its Energy Justice Commission and the Grantham Institute. So just a couple of words about the Grantham Institute. We're the hub of the environment and climate change activity at Imperial College, and we aim to empower the future leaders, training them in PhDs and masters. We initiate, develop and support multidisciplinary research, and we accelerate clean tech and innovation, and we foster new collaborations both in Imperial and way beyond. And finally, we communicate knowledge and inform and shape decision-making, and tonight's meeting is very much in that line. So I will now, having welcomed you on behalf of Imperial, hand over to Tom Kibasi from IPPR. Tom.
Thank you very much. Well, it's my pleasure to add my welcome on behalf of IPPR. This event is part of a series for our Environmental Justice Commission, which we launched earlier this year. The Commission is a cross-party initiative. It's co-chaired by Ed Miliband, Caroline Lucas from the Green Party, and Laura Sands from the Conservatives. And it brings together a really interesting coalition of people. So we've got activists from Extinction Rebellion and the student climate strikers. We've got people from trade unions, from academia, civil society, business, all together in a room. What we're doing is lots of work to figure out how we can confront this crisis. And that work will be done in time for COP26 in Glasgow at the end of next year. Now, it's my pleasure this evening to introduce to you Scarlett Westbrook, who is going to introduce Ed and Naomi and tonight's event. Scarlett is a community engagement coordinator for the UK Student Climate Network. She's really passionate about the Green New Deal. She comes from Solihull. She's currently the person in the UK who is the youngest person in the UK with an A-level in government and politics. And she's going to tell you a little bit more about why she's so passionate about this issue and a little bit about tonight's event. So please join with me in welcoming her up to the front. Thank you.
Hello everyone, my name's Scarlett. I'm 15 years old. I'm also currently the youngest person in the world to have an A-level in government and politics, as Tom just said, which I attained when I was 13, and a member of UKSCN, which is the UK Student Climate Network. So over the past 6 youth strikes, we've seen hundreds of thousands of people come out onto the streets to protest the government's lack of action on the climate crisis. By definition, politics is the process by which conflict is resolved, and this is arguably the biggest conflict, the biggest crisis we have ever faced. Yet our government is not passing the scientifically necessary legislation we need. I strike because climate change won't discriminate. We need to sustain our livelihoods, our planet, our lives, and when the effects of climate change start to affect us more noticeably than they do now, we're all going to be affected, but it's those who are less privileged who will bear the brunt of it more than others. And they will be affected by it disproportionately. Climate justice and social justice go hand in hand, which is why I'm excited about Naomi's work, particularly on the Green New Deal. At UKSCN, one of our demands is for the government to implement a Green New Deal, and so Naomi's book, On Fire, The Burning Case for a Green New Deal, particularly resonates with me. Now, I'd like you all to, I'm really excited to their conversation, and I'm sure we're going to get some brilliant insights on the fight for our futures. But first, we're going to see a video which is produced by Naomi Klein from the future to see what the world might be like if we solve the climate crisis.
The bullet train from New York to DC. It always brings me back to when I first started making this commute. In 2019, I was a freshman in the most diverse Congress in history. Up to that point, it was a critical time. I'll never forget the children in our community. They were so inspired to see this new class of politicians who reflected them, navigating the halls of power. It's often said, you can't be what you can't see. And for the first time, they saw themselves. I think there was something similar with the Green New Deal. We knew that we needed to save the planet, and that we had all the technology to do it. But people were scared. They said it was too big, too fast, not practical. I think that's because they just couldn't picture it yet. Anyways, I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's start with how we got here. 1977, New York. A senior scientist named James Black made a presentation about how burning fossil fuels could eventually lead to global temperatures rising 4 or 5 degrees Fahrenheit. Within 2 years, one of the world's biggest supertankers was outfitted with a state-of-the-art lab to measure CO2 in the ocean, gathering more data about global warming. Guess who was doing all of this research? ExxonMobil, the oil and gas company. Oh yeah, Exxon knew this whole time, as did our politicians. 10 years later, James Hansen, NASA's top climate scientist, told Congress he was 99% certain that global warming was happening and caused by humans. That was 1988, the year before I was even born. So did Exxon listen to the science, including their own? Did they change business models, invest in renewables? No, the opposite. They knew and they doubled down. They and others spent millions setting up a network of lobby groups and think tanks to create doubt and denial about climate change. It was an effort designed to attack and dispute the very kind of science they themselves had been doing. And it worked. Politicians went to bat for fossil fuels, and these massive corporations kept digging and mining, drilling and fracking like there was no tomorrow. America became the biggest producer and consumer of oil in the world. Fossil fuel companies made hundreds of billions, while the public paid the lion's share to clean up their disasters. We lost a generation of time we'll never get back. Entire species will never get back. Natural wonders gone forever. And in 2017, Hurricane Maria destroyed the place where my family was from, Puerto Rico. It was like a climate bomb. It took as many American lives as 9/11. And in the next year, when I was elected to Congress, the world's leading climate scientists declared another emergency. They told us that we had 12 years left to cut our emissions in half, or hundreds of millions of people would be more likely to face food and water shortages, poverty, and death. 12 years to change everything. How we got around, how we fed ourselves, how we made our stuff, how we lived and worked, everything. The only way to do it was to transform our economy, which we already knew was broken, since the vast majority of wealth was going to just a small handful of people, and most folks were falling further and further behind. It was a true turning point. Lots of people gave up. They said we were doomed. But some of us remembered that as a nation, we'd been in peril before. The Great Depression, World War II. We knew from our history how to pull together to overcome impossible odds. And at the very least, we owed it to our children to try. The wave began when Democrats took back the House in 2018, and then the Senate and the White House in 2020, and launched the decade of the Green New Deal, a flurry of legislation that kicked off our social and ecological transformation to save the planet. It was the kind of swing-for-the-fence ambition we needed. Finally, we were entertaining solutions on the scale of the crises we faced without leaving anyone behind. That included Medicare for All, the most popular social program in American history. We also introduced the federal jobs guarantee, a public option including dignified living wages for work. Funnily enough, the biggest problem in those early years was a labor shortage. We were building a national smart grid, retrofitting every building in America, putting trains like this one all across the country. We needed more workers. That group of kids from my neighborhood were right in the middle of it all, especially this one girl, Ileana. Her first job out of college was with AmeriCorps Climate, restoring wetlands and bayous in coastal Louisiana. Most of her friends were in her union, including some oil workers in transition. They took apart old pipelines and got to work planting mangroves with the same salary and benefits. Of course, when it came to healing the land, we had huge gaps in our knowledge. Luckily, indigenous communities offered generational expertise to help guide the way. Ileana got restless, tried her hand as a solar plant engineer for a while, but eventually made her career in raising the next generation as part of the Universal Child Care Initiative. As it turns out, caring for others is valuable, low-carbon work, and we started paying real money to folks like teachers, domestic workers, and home health aides. Those were years of massive change, and not all of it was good. When Hurricane Sheldon hit southern Florida, parts of Miami went underwater for the last time. But as we battled the floods, fires, and droughts, we knew how lucky we were to have started acting when we did. And we didn't just change the infrastructure, we changed how we did things. We became a society that was not only modern and wealthy, but dignified and humane too. By committing to universal rights like healthcare and meaningful work for all, we stopped being so scared of the future. We stopped being scared of each other, and we found our shared purpose. Ileana heard the call too, and in 2028, she ran for office in the first cycle of publicly funded election campaigns. And now she occupies the seat that I once held. I couldn't be more proud of her, a true child of the Green New Deal. When I think back to my first term in Congress, riding that old school Amtrak in 2019, all of this was still ahead of us. And the first big step was just closing our eyes and imagining it. We can be whatever we have the courage to see.
Now, it's my absolute pleasure to invite you all to give a very warm welcome to Naomi Klein and Ed Miliband and invite them to take their seats.
Thank you, everyone. What a great video. Thank you for being here. I know Naomi needs no introduction, but she's an amazing campaigner, author of No Logo, The Shock Doctrine, This Changes Everything, and the book you've all got to buy afterwards. And you can get it signed and dedicated to you or your family and friends, On Fire, the Burning Case for a Green New Deal. Why don't we start, because the video is incredibly powerful, telling us how the video came about and why do you think it's necessary? Because it speaks to the bigger cause here, obviously.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm just delighted to be here, to be in conversation with you, Ed, and really grateful for the way you have championed the Green New Deal framing in the UK and for all of your leadership on climate justice. And I want to thank Scarlett for being here tonight and for your powerful words and for your leadership. I hope you saw a future in that video that looked exciting. We're not going to win a future like that if we're sort of in favor of it. We're going to have to be on fire for it, right? That's why I called the book On Fire, because it isn't just the planet that's on fire, though that too. The movements are on fire, right? The student strike movement is on fire. 7 million people participating in the last global climate strike, by far the biggest climate action in the history of the planet. And of course, Extinction Rebellion is on fire, and despite being banned preemptively in a draconian move that is waging war on the basic right to peaceful protest, thousands of people went to Trafalgar Square today and called out the real criminals, who are the fossil fuel companies, who we now know, thanks to some great reporting in The Guardian, Shell and Exxon alone plan to expand their oil production between now and 2030 by 35%. And that's a problem, because the IPCC has told us that between now and 2030, we need to cut global emissions in half. Those two things can't happen at the same time. And before I answer your question about the video, I want to acknowledge the amazing leadership of the Grantham Institute on this, because I remember several years ago, and this is a little untold history about some movement history, where this terrific research came out from the Grantham Institute and Carbon Tracker in 2011 about the fact that fossil fuel companies had a great deal more in reserve than was in their carbon reserves than was compatible with what governments were saying they were going to do in their climate negotiations, keep temperatures below 2 degrees of warming. And so this report came out, and it came out as a warning to investors, like, you've got a problem here. You're going to have these stranded assets because obviously we can't burn that carbon and do what our governments are saying they were going to do. And I read that report, and so did my friend Bill McKibben, and we deeply appreciated the depths of that research, and that we now knew how much these companies, how much carbon they had laid claim to was already on their books. They were already assuring their investors. It was already factored into their stock price. But see, Bill and I were a little bit worried that they were going to burn it. Because, of course, what our governments say in these climate negotiations is non-binding. Unfortunately, in large part because of the United States going to climate after climate negotiation and making sure that they're non-binding. And so we were afraid that if there wasn't a social movement saying to investors that this is immoral and that we need to divest from these companies, that they would burn the carbon. And that was when we launched the fossil fuel divestment movement, which now has $11 trillion in funds committed to divesting from fossil fuels. So it actually started with research. Just 3 weeks ago, the University of California system, which has an endowment worth $80 billion, announced after 7 years of pressure that they were finally divesting from fossil fuels. So those of you who sometimes question the importance of research, whether to engage in research or activism, to me it's a really great story about how research can really fuel activism and can begin to be part of a process of changing the world. So that film with Molly came out of, we found ourselves in a situation where all of a sudden the Green New Deal was on the political map. We didn't expect it. A lot of us have been calling for this for a long time, didn't seem to be getting anywhere. That all of a sudden the Democrats won back Congress in 2016, and a scrappy young group of activists in a group called the Sunrise Movement, which is a youth-led climate movement in the United States, decided to do something very, very impolite, which was not to throw a victory parade for the Democrats, having just won back Congress, but to occupy the office of the most powerful Democrat in Washington, Nancy Pelosi, and demand a Green New Deal. That was very, very unexpected. But what was truly unexpected was that a young congresswoman, the youngest woman ever elected to Congress, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, decided to stop by this very impolite office occupation by these young people and cheer them on. And they were also cheered on by other insurgent candidates who were part of this new wave, who were running within the Democratic Party, but running against the establishment of the Democratic Party, calling for a much more transformative agenda. Alexandria had run on a platform calling for a Green New Deal, but it wasn't the policy of the party. In fact, Nancy Pelosi called it the Green Dream or whatever. And I thought that Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez's tweet in response was, "You're right, it is our green dream." And we're not going to be embarrassed about dreaming. And so there started to be a really, really strong attack on the Green New Deal about how unrealistic it was, even though it was gaining a lot of popularity, and a lot of candidates running for president were saying that they supported it. Basically, we just decided that we needed to get artists involved in it, and I called Molly, because she's an amazing artist, Molly Crabapple, and what we were talking about was, how do we get artists involved in telling the story of how we need a Green New Deal? Because in the original New Deal that FDR introduced in the 1930s, arts was a huge part of it. FDR believed that artists were workers like anyone else, and the whole country was hurting in the 1930s in the midst of the Great Depression. So he unleashed the biggest public funding program for the arts that the country had ever seen. Hundreds of thousands of works of art were created, plays, murals inspired by Diego Rivera. Orson Welles produced an all-black a cast of Othello. It was a time of incredible creativity, and it enlisted the best artists in the country to both tell the story of the Green New Deal and also just to bring art to every single community and explode the idea that art is something that only elites have a right to enjoy. So what Molly and I were talking about was that kind of art is actually low carbon and it improves quality of life. And we know that as we deal with the climate crisis, there are going to be parts of our lives where we are going to have to contract, the endless cycle of disposable consumption. But we also know that that's not what actually makes us happy. What actually builds strong community is things like art, access to nature, time in community, more time spent with friends and family. And so we need to invest in policies that make that possible. And so Molly just said, this is what I want to do. And we decided to cast it in the future because, I think many of you have probably encountered this or felt it yourself, that when we come up against a crisis of this scale, we're in a society that tells us that all we are selfish individuals and that we're not capable of doing anything big together, it can feel really hopeless. And Hollywood doesn't help us much with that, because most visions of the future that we're shown these days in Hollywood films or Netflix series, it's generally pretty grim. It's generally Clive 5 versions of ourselves where we're just us, only like way worse and maybe eating each other's kids or something like that, right? And so. You
left that bit out of the film. I'm glad. That's good. That's
so we just thought, well, maybe we could show an image of the future where we decide not to turn on each other. That was a sort of exotic idea.
No, it's incredibly important. Can I just say to the people at the back, there are some seats. I mean, we're not going to be using our seats. If there's anyone, because I saw some people who got turned away at the back, and there are a couple down here. So if you've still got people who you need to seat, please do. And just say to the audience, you're going to get time to ask questions of Naomi in about 20 minutes or so. So I think the film is incredibly powerful. I think the idea of the Green New Deal is incredibly powerful. I just want to talk a bit about that, because you say in your book something which I think is profoundly important and is in a way self-critical, I think, of the movement. You say this: half the problem is that progressives, their hands full with battling systemic, economic and racial exclusions, tend to assume that big green groups have the climate issue covered. The other half of the problem is that many of the biggest big green groups have avoided with phobic precision any serious debate on the blindingly obvious roots of the climate crisis: globalization, deregulation, and contemporary capitalism's quest for perpetual growth. Talk a little bit about that sort of divide that there has been in the movement, because I was a climate change secretary in 2008, 2010. There is this tendency to see climate change as, let's fix that problem, and then let's fix the economic problems.
Right.
And the beauty of the Green New Deal is it brings both together.
Right. And I think the problem with this idea that we could separate them, I mean, I think there are a lot of problems with it. I think it's just simply untrue, because at the heart of this crisis really is a crisis of overconsumption and a particular way of life that really isn't sustainable. But there's also just this cyclical problem that we encounter where, when things are going relatively well economically, and you can kind of graph this, then that tends to be the moment where there'll be a lot of excitement and energy about doing something about the environment, and people sort of feel they're doing fairly well, so maybe they can pay a little bit more for things, and that's okay. But then as soon as there's an economic downturn, it just gets wiped off the map. And that's what happened in Europe with the 2008 financial crisis. It happened at a bit of a lag, right? It wasn't really until 2009 where you just started to see it just completely, the bottom drop out. But, talking about I feel like we're doing so well. Do we really want to look back? No, but I remember meeting with Alexis Tsipras before he was elected, when he was leader of the opposition. And I made the case to him, and I was working on This Changes Everything. It hadn't come out yet at the time, that it'd be a great time for a left party like his to bring together the climate crisis and the economic crisis and talk about green jobs and talk about how we can have a different kind of economy to get our way out of crisis, and we can have publicly owned renewable energy, community-owned renewable energy that will bring resources to communities to pay for services.
What did he say?
And he literally said to me, I think no is enough right now. And that's why my book, my last book was called No Is Not Enough. Because, he said to me, this is a moment of rejection. This is a moment where it's so important for Greeks to just reject this brutal austerity that is being enforced upon us. And this was a moment where people were filling the squares in Athens and so many other places in Southern Europe and saying no, and that powerful rejection. And I think, to some extent, when you're in one of those moments, it's scary to actually pin down what you want, because you think that maybe it'll limit who's going to be with you, because in those sort of effervescent moments where everyone's just saying, no, we don't want this, that's a common binding agent, right? And you don't have to agree on much in order to all agree that you don't want that bad thing, right? Whether it's a dictator, or whether it's brutal austerity. But the problem is, when you open up that vacuum and you don't provide real solutions, then somebody fills the vacuum, right? I mean, Tsipras was elected, but I think the political disillusionment in Greece that has been left by the sort of failure to provide that vision, the Greek people are paying for that tremendously. They don't deserve that. And so it's our responsibility to not just reject, but also to propose what we want instead. And I don't know, I think there are lots of reasons why it took as long as it did to get to this point, this idea that somehow you can't ask people to care about the environment when they are in a place of economic hardship. I heard the same from Podemos's leadership, at the height of the economic crisis.
But to be fair, unless you place, as Macron has found out, unless you place the economic crisis, the environmental crisis, in a social and economic justice box, as well as take it out of simply an environmental box, then it's a fair worry.
Well, look, but I'm not arguing. I've never been arguing for neoliberal solutions to the climate crisis. And Macron has shown us very clearly what it looks like when you ask people who are already overstressed, overburdened, and watching your government attack trade union rights, impose economic austerity, hand out tax cuts to millionaires and corporations. Oh, and by the way, our climate plan is for you to pay more for gas. People will reject that, just as in Ecuador they rejected it. You can't pair economic austerity and attacks on the social safety net with asking regular people to pay more for carbon and call that a climate policy. Not only will the carbon pricing not get the job done, which is its own problem because the pricing is too low, but you will generate your own backlash. And Macron's just an extreme example of this. I mean, I live in the States right now, but I recently moved from Ontario, which is where I've lived most of my life.
You have
Ontario,
two passports, Canada. Correct?
I do, yeah. And we had a liberal government that introduced carbon pricing in Ontario that came to be associated with increased electricity costs. And we have our very own Donald Trump now, a guy named Doug Ford, famous because his brother was Rob Ford, famous for smoking crack and getting away with it. And he ran on a platform of rolling back the carbon pricing and giving people $1 a beer and rolling back sex education to 1992 levels.
So, not a good platform.
He's done it all but $1 a beer.
So let me ask you then about this balance between the... So the way I sometimes talk about this is that I say to people, Martin Luther King didn't say, I have a nightmare. He said, I have a dream. And what is the balance, do you think? So I represent a relatively working class part of England, Doncaster North, high Brexit voting constituency. And I often think, and the reason I'm doing this Environmental Justice Commission in part is because I think, well, this has got to speak to my constituents. Yeah. If you were talking to a voter in my constituency, what is the balance between warning about the nightmare and the dangers for them and their kids, and the dream, the jobs, the air quality, the all of the benefits, the public transport benefits, all of the social justice benefits. Do you need, you need both?
Yeah. I think you do. I think you need, in the Sunrise Movement, they talk about promise and peril. And that's the moment that we're in. And I think the peril that we're in isn't only climate. I think people are frightened for the future on many different fronts. I think people don't even really see a future right now. So I think we need a holistic analysis that brings together the way we're treating our natural environment like trash and the way we treat people like trash. This sort of the extractive mindset, right, is not only about thinking we can exhaust nature without limit. It's also thinking we can exhaust people without limit. I mean, you look at what the way the gig economy treats workers, and this sort of the endless, just the complete disregard and exploitation at the core of that. So I think we always need to connect the environmental and the social and labor in the peril and the promise. So, I use a frame, and I used it when I spoke at the labor conference a couple of years ago, that we need to move from the dig and gig economy to a culture based on care and repair. And one of the things I'm always banging on about in terms of the Green New Deal is that it's not just the classic green jobs that we need to talk about, the solar engineers and the people putting up wind turbines. That's all good, and we need that, and we can create millions of good jobs. But there's a lot of low carbon work that's already being done that is overwhelmingly done by women, that is undervalued because it is women's work, and overwhelmingly women of color doing care work. And we need to fight to make those good jobs as well. So that's the care piece, and the repair piece, I think, has to do with repairing our relationship to the earth, repairing our stuff instead of just throwing it away and being in these cycles of constant obsolescence, and also repairing our relationships with the most abused communities, the people who have really borne the toxic burden. So I don't know. I think that we just. I think we have the promise and the peril, but even more important is we have to constantly make the connections between what we're doing to the planet and what is being done
to people.
To people, yeah.
Then let me ask about a related issue, which is system change and individual change. I'm glad to say that there's a very good little booklet here, which I've taken, which is 9 things you can do about climate change. Now, I don't want to quote you out of context here, but partly to be provocative, I just quote what you say in the book, because I think it's important for the way we frame discussions about climate change. You say this: the hard truth is that the answer to the question, what can I as an individual do to stop climate change, is nothing. The very idea that we as atomized individuals could play a significant part in stabilizing the planet's climate system is objectively nuts. Now, I know you're not saying people should, just do what they like.
Right.
But I think if you think about the way that certainly the critique of Emma Thompson when she ended up at Extinction Rebellion, she flew there, the criticism of AOC, it very much sort of builds on the idea that it's all about what is the individual doing. Mm-hmm. Talk about this question of system change and individual change and what we as individuals should do.
Yeah. So I think, as individuals, we should do what we can to lower our carbon footprints. It's a good thing to do. In many cases, it will make our bodies healthier. It will prove to ourselves that actually it's not the end of the world. And we hear a lot of scaremongering about how our quality of life will collapse if we take this crisis seriously. And it's good to know in your body that it isn't true. But I think it's actually really, really dangerous to make a fetish of being like the perfect low carbon activist, because it sends a message that you really can't join the movement until you've reached that level of purity. And the fact is that most people, and I'd imagine most people, who you represent, are too busy, too overloaded, don't have access to a lot of what they need to make those low carbon choices, whether it's the kind of transit that they need, whether it is access even to healthy food. We have a lot of places that, I mean, look at where fast food restaurants are located versus where health food stores are located, and so on, right? So I think I worry that this fetish is a recipe for having a very privileged, overwhelmingly white movement, which has been true of the climate movement for a long time. And I think that is a failure on a lot of different fronts. It means that it's not representing the people who are most impacted by our extractive economy, because it is the poorest communities that get the dirtiest industries in their backyards, whose kids have asthma and bear the toxic burden in their bodies. But also because, just strategically, I actually think that a mostly privileged movement isn't going to fight hard enough. The people who have the most to gain from the kind of transformative change that we're talking about are the people who are getting the worst deal in our current economy. And they would fight for this future, not because it's better than apocalypse and extinction, but because it's better than Tuesday, right? And so, I think that there's been a real strategic mistake in thinking that it's possible to win, to build a movement capable of winning the kind of structural change that we're talking about without having a really working class movement.
Which the climate movement, for all its great virtues, is not at the moment.
Has not been. There is a wing of the climate movement that is the climate justice movement, and the climate movement is global and represents, there are many different climate movements, but there is a part of the climate movement that, as Arundhati Roy says, it asks the question, how do I change without changing? What is the least I can possibly do in the face of this crisis? Because this system is pretty much working well for me. Can I get away with a marginal carbon tax, maybe an electric car? What is the least that I can do? Because I don't want to rock the boat, because the boat is basically working for me. And that makes sense for the winners in our current economic system. The fact is we have an incredibly and increasingly unequal economic system, right? And so the people who are not the winners of that economic system are not afraid of change because they are being left behind, but they're expressing their desire for change, in spasmodic and dangerous ways, like voting for Donald Trump or, fill in the blanks.
Sorry. I also think sort of implicit in this, there's good news, which is that most people do want to go green, but are you going to make it possible for them to do so? I often cite the statistic that I think 60% of cars in Norway that are sold are electric. And I'm not saying electric cars are the answer to everything, and 3% are here. Now, we all love the Norwegians, but it's not simply because Norwegians are decent people. No. It's because the incentives are to go green in Norway.
Yes.
And therefore you're not just saying it's all up to the individual to do it.
Look, I often say I used to smoke a pack of cigarettes a day, and it wasn't that I didn't know that smoking was bad for me. I knew. And I stopped smoking when my government basically turned me into a complete pariah by banning smoking in restaurants and bars, and I found myself in a very cold climate, shivering outside alone, miserably, sucking on a cancer stick, and I just thought it wasn't a good look, and I eventually just
very sensible.
Gave it up. But I sometimes we need the help of government regulations. I'm willing to admit that I'm weak in that way.
Talk to us about another big issue in this.
I just want to say one other thing about the personal thing. You saw a little clip of me on Sky News this morning with Adam Bolton.
Did he ask you whether you came here by boat?
He didn't, but see, I asked him. I was dressed fairly smartly, and before the cameras rolled, I said, "Do I look nice?" Because I want to make sure that I'm in the hypocrite camp and not the crusty camp.
Uncooperative crusty.
Yeah. So and he was quite taken aback by that. Yeah. So he didn't ask me. But the point is, you're either a hypocrite, or you're a crusty who shouldn't be listened to. There is no way to win this game. Yeah. Look at Greta. She sailed across the Atlantic. Has that quieted the trolls one bit? The whole reason why this is happening is because they would rather change the subject.
I think we should claim crusty. I think we should claim crusty as a virtue. I think he might have.
Let's claim crusty. Yeah. Let's claim hypocrite.
Redefine and claim
change
crusty.
The subject.
Talk to us about growth. and economic growth in this. And you know, because clearly there's a massive aspect of this, which is the developing world and the fact that, you know, we've polluted the atmosphere. We, developed countries, have polluted the atmosphere, and now we are asking developing countries to not go down our route, but to change. And there's a huge debate in the movement about, you know, should you be agnostic about growth, anti-growth, but can you be anti-growth and still make this a working class movement? Talk to us about how you think about that.
I think the way I think about it is I think what we cannot have is an economy that measures progress through the pursuit of indiscriminate growth. I think that is a recipe for what we have right now. But I am not a degrowth fanatic. I don't like the word. I don't feel it's. I don't think you build a movement for degrowth. And I also think there's going to be growth. So I think what we need is a designed, more deliberate economy where we identify the areas where we can have abundance, and we identify the areas where we need to have contraction. In those areas that are exhausting the natural world and polluting it, we need to design to contract those areas. And we need to identify those areas where we can afford to have abundance that actually increase quality of life. I named a few. The arts, access to nature, the care professions. There's a lot of research
all of which
that
need
shows,
to grow.
all of which can grow, and as we decarbonize them.
Yeah.
You know, I had an event at the university where I teach, Rutgers University, a couple of weeks ago, which we called Care Work is Climate Work, and we brought together leaders of teachers unions and nursing unions and home care workers alliances to talk about how to decarbonize their professions. They're already low carbon, but you know, home care workers you know, have to burn carbon in a lot of times getting from house to house because they don't have access to public transit. And there's definitely ways to make you know, hospitals greener and so on. You know, we already have some fantastic examples for how to green the education sector. You know, so let's focus there and let's invest in those areas and let's make them better. Let's have smaller class sizes and pay teachers better and have more teachers and things like that. And you know, our kids would be better educated, and that's, you know, that's a place we can grow. But the tricky thing is we have to be honest that there is an actual risk of a Green New Deal carbon spike if we aren't serious about auditing our own carbon. Because if you're changing the building blocks of your society, this is a construction boom, right? It is a huge construction boom, and an economy that runs on fossil fuels, as you build out that renewable infrastructure, you're actually going to burn, ironically, a lot of carbon. And as you decide to pay people you know, fair and good wages for their work, the Green New Deal in the US talks about a jobs guarantee. You may well have people spending their salaries at Walmart and, you know, fueling the cycle of endless consumption. So there's going to have to be a way in which we keep ourselves honest about this. So I don't know. What do you think? How do you deal with the degrowth question?
Well, I think I'm in your camp, which is it depends. You know, Robert Kennedy said 50 years ago that growth was not the answer, and we've taken a long time to learn the lesson. It doesn't measure the things that really matter, environmental limits. There's no sense of distribution. And are we? And so, you know, I look at all those things in the film. Those are really important jobs that need to be done, and they will contribute to economic growth. I think the sort of the kind of knock-on effects of how people spend the money is difficult. But it partly, for me, means you can't just have some green policies and then the rest of your economy.
Yeah.
And also, you've got to start getting into trade policy, and we can't just keep importing goods from other countries where you're using, you know, where you're kind of importing your high carbon.
Yeah.
Or rather, exporting your carbon. I want to ask you one question and then go to
one thing I would just add is that I think as we design these Green New Deals or green industrial policies or whatever we're going to call them, I think we don't have to settle this question, the growth question, which is a very, very thorny question, But I do think we need to build in mechanisms to keep ourselves honest. So I think we need to be drawing on the world's leading emission reduction experts and be building in regular carbon audits to make sure that we aren't inadvertently, burning too much carbon with the best of intentions, because we could well do that.
Let me ask you, and I'm going to go to the audience, so do get ready for your questions to Naomi. Let me ask you about the moment we're in, because I think you and I both agree that the combination of Extinction Rebellion, the climate strikes, what you're doing, AOC, makes this, in one sense, a very pessimistic moment, but in another sense, quite an optimistic moment. But talk to us about the sort of permeability of politics to that movement. So there's a Canadian election on Monday, correct? Yes? Next Monday.
So that's yeah,
it is.
The 21st.
Remember to vote.
I've voted.
You voted already, right? Okay. You were responsible for something which I think was a really important initiative, which was, I think it's called the LEAP Manifesto, which were before the last Canadian election, about how to make environmental issues be taken seriously. How permeable is politics to this in Canada, the US, Britain? Because you feel at one level, and this is something obviously I'm wrestling with. We may have a general election here soon, like tomorrow.
But I feel like you guys have been saying this for 2 years.
Yeah, we have. But talk to us about, is this an issue in Canada at the elections? In a good way? What?
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely been a change over 4 years, which isn't a lot of time in politics, but unfortunately is a lot of time on the climate clock. So 4 years ago, we did launch the LEAP Manifesto in the middle of a Canadian election. It was a movement manifesto. It came out of 60 movement leaders coming together and drafting this people's platform. I was the guarder of the track changes, which was the hardest thing I've ever had to deal with. And we had this coalition of labor leaders, Indigenous rights leaders, climate groups, transit rights activists, food justice activists, migrant rights activists, and so on. And we came up with this short platform. If people want to read it, they can look it up at theleap.org. And it was signed by tens of thousands of people, but it wasn't on the ballot, right? And people would put LEAP signs on their lawns and pressured their politicians, but no party, except for the Green Party, which has one seat, would endorse it. And even our left party, our third party, the NDP, was pretty scared of it. And they were not really willing to consider a science-based and justice-based approach to the climate crisis, and one that connected the dots between all of these issues. And so here we are 4 years later, and our LEAP team has worked on a Green New Deal platform with many of the same movements that we did the LEAP with, and we now have one of the political parties running on it, the NDP, the Greens as well. And we, best case scenario for this election on Monday is that we end up with a kind of a coalition. We don't have proportional representation, but it would be a liberal minority. And Justin Trudeau doesn't deserve
We've
another
got experience
majority.
of hung parliaments here.
Yeah, I know he's cute, by the way, but Justin Trudeau has really screwed up on a lot of fronts. And I think he's really shown the limits of sort of performance politics, right? Of the sort of empty meme of politics. And it's and his hypocrisy is showing, obviously on race, but not just because of the blackface scandals, also because after, showing off his bicep with his, raven tattoo from one of the most famous Indigenous artists in Canada, he's, pushed through pipelines, through Indigenous territories against the, express opposition, despite the express opposition of Indigenous people on those territories, and even bought himself an oil pipeline. So, look, I don't want the Conservatives to win back power, but I don't want the Liberals to have another majority. So what we want is for them to have a minority I was just having a flashback about something funny, I'll tell you. But
I was going to say, it's one mistake I never made, show off my biceps. I'm now quite pleased it was a mistake I didn't make.
You don't have some like, exciting tattoo under there? Yeah, so anyway, we want a minority government because minority governments have to listen to people in a way that majority governments...
Maybe it's time to go to the audience.
votes.
Right, okay, let's take questions now. Please make them questions. I'll take them in groups of 3. Try not to make it a speech. We've got about half an hour, so good time for you to ask questions. Yes, a question is sort of midway down on the left-hand side. And if you say your name as well.
Claire Sakier, I'm the Climate Change Director.
What's your first name, sorry?
Claire.
Claire.
Claire at IIED. We're running up to COP26. In fact, we've got the next COP to go, but in the next just over a year, we've got a lot to do on climate action. And the politics globally just isn't looking good. The UK's leading the COP next year, but is very distracted. What can we possibly be doing?
Good question. And I think along the road, just the gentleman, yep.
Joel from Carbon Tracker. So thanks for the plug. And you mentioned the obviously the fossil fuel industry, a major problem, and you mentioned the 2008 financial crisis and the collapse of the financial system. So I guess my question for you is, what should we be guarding against, thinking back to, for example, 2010, when BP almost collapsed? There was sort of talks to rescue these oil companies. So how do we not repeat the mistakes of 2008 by bailing out the fossil fuel industry with no questions asked, not putting conditions on shutting them down, executive pay, those sorts of things? So how can we be better prepared next time?
Okay, that's a good question. And then yes, the lady here.
Hi, thanks. My name's Goodwin Gibbons. I'm a PhD student here at Imperial. I was wondering, thank you for a great talk, by the way, that was great.
What's your PhD on?
I do climate science.
Great.
And atmospheric physics. So I was wondering just if you could comment on what role you think negative emissions might play in helping to explain the gravity of emissions that make it into the atmosphere.
Just say the last bit again. What role negative emissions can play?
Yeah, maybe, for example, in helping to understand how hard it is to undo emissions that have been done, or anyway, what role you see for them in the future. Thank you.
What was your name, sorry?
Goodwin.
Goodwin, thanks.
Anybody have any easy questions?
Yeah, like negative emissions. Yeah, you can do the hard ones. Well, I think there's quite a good range of things. I mean, I'm glad Claire asked this question about COP26 because, you know, with British understatement, Claire said we were distracted. I mean, I was at Copenhagen, so were you?
I remember.
Yeah. You know, this requires every ounce of diplomatic muscle to make this a success, even when the stars are well aligned and they're not that well aligned. So talk to us about that, what we can do, and the fossil fuel companies and negative emissions.
Right. So what can you do? So I think people are doing a lot, and I think that we are seeing a real shift in the political class feeling like they need to respond. Whether the policies are really there with teeth is another question. But I think that that there has been that sense of emergency, that declaration of emergency from below, this sort of breaking of this cycle of people feeling terrified, alone, staring at their lonely screens, and then feeling like there's something wrong with them because everybody else is just talking about Brexit. I think we owe a lot to Extinction Rebellion and the student strikers for creating spaces for people to come together and be like, okay, it's not just me. I also see this as an emergency. But, you know, as I said earlier, I think no is not enough. I don't think it's enough to just declare an emergency, because emergencies are dangerous. States of emergencies are dangerous when you have untrustworthy elites. They can be used in all kinds of ways. You can declare a climate emergency and say that's why we need to shut down the borders and just look after our own. We know what climate justice is. The Green New Deal comes out of decades of work from movements in the global south and in frontline communities. And that's the importance of having having the vision that we are putting forward and working with political forces who are committed to turning it into law and making sure that they're committed. And I can say that I think that the Labour Party is making made a lot of progress in a short time in terms of really embracing this framework. I hope it is the platform that they run on, and by platform I mean not just the climate policy, but actually the framework, because I think what we need more than anything is a sense of common mission and common purpose for how we're going to, solve multiple crises at the same time. And so I think people need to hear from their constituents that they want the Green New Deal or the Green Industrial Revolution, but I have to say I don't like that branding very much because it leaves out too many workers who are outside of the industrial sectors and it leaves out a lot of women workers. So I think we need a green jobs revolution. I think we need a Green New Deal. I know that there wasn't a New Deal in this country. There wasn't a New Deal in the country that I've come from either, Canada. But I don't really care what it's called, frankly, but there has to be a common story where everybody sees themselves in it, where everybody is included in it. And so I think really, honestly, the most important thing you can do ahead of playing that leadership role at COP is elect Labour. I'm sorry. I mean, I don't have to be nonpartisan.
Don't apologize to me.
God, you're a tough crowd. Why aren't you cheering? In terms of
vested interests, the fossil fuel companies, the divestment campaign has been a great sort of success.
It has been, but there is, and we need to go after the banks as well. We need to go after the banks and the hedge funds and the insurance companies that are underwriting this industry. And I would encourage people to read Bill McKibben's really excellent essay in The New Yorker that really mapped the way in which these industries, the fossil fuel companies, are being underwritten by companies like BlackRock and JP Morgan and so on. We need to choose our targets in the way that we did in the fossil fuel divestment movement. And in terms of the companies themselves, we need to guard against what is sometimes called profitable bankruptcy, right? Which we saw with the coal companies, right? Where they declared bankruptcy, paid off their executives handsomely, paid off in some cases their memberships at golf clubs, and screwed their workers and screwed communities. I think we are in the dying days of profits being made in this sector, and I believe the public has a right to those profits. This is an industry that has known since the 1970s that its business model was warming the planet.
Yep.
They spread doubt, they spread lies.
Covered it up.
And now we are stuck with the bill. And climate justice doesn't just mean that the people on the front lines of the crisis need to benefit from the solutions. It also means that the people who created the crisis with their eyes wide open need to pay for the costs of this. And so we need to figure out how to get the profits from the dying days of fossil fuels.
Just on negative emissions.
Yeah, negative.
Just help us out here. Sorry.
Well, I think you're talking about carbon drawdown, right? That what the IPCC has told us is that even if we do everything possible to decarbonize our economies globally in this very tight time frame, we have already put too much carbon in the atmosphere beyond safe levels. So we actually need to draw some down.
Yeah.
So there's a few ways of doing that. So we're not talking about carbon capture technologies that are connected to new pollution. We're talking about the idea of air capture. So there are some technologies where you build kind of metal trees and actually suck that carbon out of the air and bury it underground. I think actual trees are pretty good at doing it. It doesn't require as much mining to get all that metal.
Some people have said, some people have said, and I don't know what you think of, that countries should set targets to get into not just zero, not just net zero, but negative emissions.
Right.
Which is one thing you could you could do.
You could. I mean, but I also think, one of the things that's exciting about it and connecting it with land rehabilitation, reforestation, revegetation is that, it should be connected with indigenous land rights. It should be connected with more sustainable farming. And it also is a way of addressing the fact that we also have an extinction crisis, right, and a biodiversity crisis. And just doing the right things when it comes to carbon does not necessarily redress this. And I think that, George Monbiot, who got arrested today, I think quite courageously, has written really wonderfully about how, solving the extinction crisis and solving the climate crisis can be done in tandem.
I would just add on Claire's question about COP26. I mean, there needs focus from the government, much more focus than I think there is. I think you need a much better near-term target for 2030, because 2050, the IPCC have told us we've got 10 years. We're going to be trying to persuade other countries, including Europe, etc., to up their targets from Paris. We can't do that by saying, well, we're sticking to where we are for 2030, whether you agree with Labour's net zero or not. You've got to be more ambitious. And I think the movement is really important in this. I mean, when I was the climate change secretary at Copenhagen, we weren't even hosting the COP, but it was a massive movement here around Copenhagen. Now, you don't want to create huge expectations and huge disappointment, but I think the movement push nationally, globally is really matters. Let's take more. Let's take more questions. Yeah, we've got a question over here.
Hi, I'm Fatima Ibrahim. I'm one of the coordinators of Green New Deal UK, so we're trying to build a movement around this radical idea in the UK. I'm also from Ontario, so worrying about 2 elections in 2 countries is stressful.
We'll talk later.
So my question is, we're in an interesting situation in the UK that's quite different to Canada and the US, where one of the major political parties has actually picked up a Green New Deal before we've been able to build a powerful movement. And I think what I'm looking for is a bit of advice how we keep some relative distance and keep the idea visionary and radical and not align ourselves too closely with political parties, though what Labour has done is incredible. We see that, placing hope in the political party can sometimes just thwart the growth of the movement. So if you have any advice on that.
Really interesting question. Yep, there's a question over here. And then I'll take the one in the middle.
Hi, Akbar. I used to be an environmental campaigner, and I used to be a banker as well, so hopefully you don't use that against me.
What was your name, sorry?
Akbar.
Akbar, great.
Hi, my question to Naomi is, I've got family and friends in the States as well, and also I follow politics in America on Twitter quite well. My question is, it's looking like Trump might win a second term. If that happens, my question is what are we doing now to help also the causes of the Green movement be in vain, or will that just make it even more, or if he does win, will that make us more likely to take even more action? So, will it be a good thing or bad thing if he wins?
Okay. Bad thing. Okay. I bet you'll get a better answer than that. There's a lady in the middle.
Hi, my name's Gabby, and my question is, basically, let's say that it's a successful Green New Deal and everything goes to plan. What do you suggest in being able to make sure that other countries follow suit? Let's take the situation like I'm Brazilian, and Bolsonaro is obviously not a nice man, to say the least, and I don't understand a way that we would be able to put enough pressure on other countries to act. Ultimately, things like the UN have notoriously not been as good as they should be on matters like this. So what suggestions do you have?
So in a way, those second and third questions are connected. It's this sort of ultimate collective action problem. Let's say we got our house in order and did the right things here, but Brazil elects Bolsonaro, the US, God forbid, elects Trump for a second term. There's maybe no good answer to this question, but what?
I have to say, pretty much all of my focus and energy is just trying to make sure that Trump does not win a second term. I'm not really ready to go there yet. I have to say I'm going to plead cross that bridge when we come to it. I don't think we ever give up throw in the towel. I mean, I think that is a luxury that most people on this planet cannot afford. And so, we'll keep fighting. And if you have a government that is committed to really leading on climate, then you will find other governments. There will be other governments who you will have to form coalitions with and exert maximum pressure with.
But also, presumably, we shouldn't be signing a trade deal with Trump if he doesn't get back into Paris. I mean,
there need to be sanctions. You
could exert influence on these governments.
There should have been. We should have climate sanctions for rogue actors like Bolsonaro and like Trump now. And that's always been the problem where, at the same time as, if you violate WTO rules, if you violate, trade rules, there are consequences for that. But if you violate climate, the rules that you agreed to, the targets that you agreed to, that your government brought to a UN climate summit, there really are no sanctions whatsoever. And we need to remedy that. I guess I don't have great answers for these worst case scenario questions.
We'll avoid them, I guess.
But, in the book, I talk about how we really are in this really dangerous moment where we have the planetary fires, but we also have these political fires. And I don't think it's a coincidence that these sort of strong men figures like Trump and Bolsonaro, but also Modi and Duterte, the list goes on, are rising to the most powerful positions in their respective countries, tapping into this feeling of deep insecurity, right? And it is the economic insecurity that we've talked about, but it is also, I believe, whether people are conscious of it or not, people understand that our home is in crisis, our collective home is in crisis. And, that state of fear that we humans are in, wherever we live right now, whether we're conscious of it or not, makes us really pliant to these figures who give easy scapegoats and turn people against each other so easily. That's the formula all these guys have of, an in-group and an out-group. And that's why having an inclusive and truly human rights-based approach to the climate crisis that attaches rights to the person, not to whether or not they have papers, what their citizenship is a really, really crucial antidote to this.
And Fatima's question, Fatima's an esteemed member of our commission, about...
It's a great question, and it's tricky. It's an interesting problem to have. But I think the answer is, if we look at the history of the original New Deal in the 1930s, it was not handed down from on high by FDR. It was really demanded from below by very organized societies, and they didn't stop when FDR was elected. I mean, if you look at strike actions in the 1930s, you see this very sharp spike after FDR is elected and starts rolling out the Green New Deal. 34, 35, 36, 37 is when you're having city shutdowns, ports shutdowns. And so I think that inside-outside dynamic is all the more important when you have a government that is receptive. When you have a government that just is going to ban protests and just doesn't care, right? In some ways, protesting, it feels more futile, but it's when there actually is, people in power who are receptive to these ideas. And that's what the Sunrisers understood. That's why they occupied Nancy Pelosi's office. They waited till the Democrats won to do it, right? So I think wherever we are, the task is an organizing task. We need to go sector by sector, workplace by workplace, and imagine what a Green New Deal means wherever we are. We only have the broadest strokes outlined right now, right? This is not an actual plan. We need to get really, really, really specific, and it needs to be exciting so that motivates people to vote and get more involved.
Great. Okay, let's take another round. I don't want to disfavor the left. Gentleman here.
Thank you, Ed. Naomi, it's a pleasure that you're here and to listen to you today. My name is Roy Henhack, and I'm representing the London Good Work Commission. My question relates to the fact that projections show 70% of the world will be living in cities or urban areas by 2050.
Sorry, I'm having a fight with this microphone at the moment.
All right.
Can you hear me
help
still?
Naomi in
I
her
could use some help.
fight
Yeah.
with the microphone?
Yeah. If someone can help me with this, then I
Yeah,
can listen to you.
somebody's coming to help you. Yeah.
Okay. And the mayor here, Sadiq Khan, has declared a climate emergency.
Yeah.
So we need to move as fast as possible to a net zero emissions city. We published our final report today, and one of the recommendations we made was that businesses that are or become net zero should benefit from tax discounts. So is that an idea that you think is good with 1 million businesses in the capital?
Everyone should read your report. There's someone waving at me. Yep.
Hi. Hello? Is that
Hello.
on? Yeah. I'd just like to pick up on the point Naomi
What's your
was
name?
talking-
Sorry.
Steve Sprung.
Hi, Steve.
I'd just like to pick up on the point you were talking about from the top and from below. Because in this country, in the late 70s, when Tony Benn was the Minister of Industry in this country, he encouraged workers to come in who were threatened with unemployment at the time and talk about what they could do to change about it, what they could do, what positive things they could come forward with instead of facing redundancies. And we've got to remember that was the start of the mass redundancies in this country across the whole of the north of England, which led to the disenchantment, which led to the Brexit vote in the kind of areas you've come from, Ed, yeah? And what Tony Benn did, he invited the workers in from Lucas Aerospace. And the workers in Lucas Aerospace were threatened with redundancy. 18,000 workers worked for Lucas Aerospace. And they came up in response to Tony, precisely from Tony Benn from the top, saying, come up with an alternative plan of what you could make instead of making jet aeroplanes for the military, right? They were threatened with redundancy because of new technology, okay?
Lucas plan.
And they came up with basically a Green New Deal plan.
They did, yeah.
And their whole plan
Totally
the whole plan was, and what they didn't just come up with, and it was accepted by the workers, all 18,000 workers, precisely because it offered them jobs.
Yeah.
But it was a Green New Deal. It was a Green New Deal. Now, I just want to say one thing about it, because it's very important history. Not only did they do that, but they actually went on to work with university departments and actually develop the products that they designed. Wind turbines, hybrid cars. They built a hybrid car in the 1970s and had it running around.
Okay, Steve,
They built
I
heat
just
pumps.
want to get some
It's
other
a very
people in.
important history.
I know, but I get that. It's a
What's very important is, just one point to add, the Labour government did not support them.
Right.
Tony Benn supported them, but he was sacked by Harold Wilson.
I was 9 years old, so I'm not taking responsibility.
We have a possibility of a Labour government now that would support that kind of activity.
Thanks, Steve.
Yeah?
Okay.
Exciting.
Hang on, I'm looking for some. Yes, the lady over here. Sorry, in the middle.
Hi, my name's Alicia. I was just wondering what you think the role of big business would play alongside governments for a Green New Deal, and what you think about CEOs like Jeff Bezos who claim that they want to start sustainable initiatives, but then their whole business model is built on like fast and throwaway
cardboard boxes.
Okay, so this is probably the final round. I'm going to take a few more, and then Naomi will get a choice as to which ones she answers. Towards the back. I'm looking for some more gender balance in these questions. Yeah.
So I think it was.
What's your name? Sorry.
Oh, hi, George Taylor. I'm a postgrad at Center of Environmental Policy. I think it was the Republican Party that first proposed a carbon tax in America, but somewhere along the lines, it became a very leftist issue. I'm wondering how we reconcile that and how we achieve bipartisan support.
Okay, there's an interesting question there, not just about the carbon tax, but bipartisan support. There's a lady here. Sorry. You don't need to answer them all.
Thank you. You mentioned
What's your name, sorry?
My name's Rebecca. I'm from the Institute and Faculty of Actuaries. You mentioned that Labour had done a particularly good job in thinking about green issues, but the Conservatives are in power at the moment, and their voter base is largely people in the baby boomer generation, and often it's considered that this issue is quite a young person's issue and a future generation's issue, in fact. How do we make this argument appeal to those generations who get out and vote more, and also there's just more of them? So if they go out and they're voting for different parties that perhaps don't have this at the top of their agenda, how do we appeal to them?
So the older generation. Yeah. Why don't we kind of group those a little bit, because there's two questions about sort of the role of business, I think. There's an interesting generational question. Yeah. There's a question about consensus, because I didn't ask you this actually in the introduction, but how important is the consensus? Because the more radical you are, maybe the less you get the consensus. And then there's the Lucas plan. But just take them as you want, and then we can.
Yeah. So the first question about the giving companies that get to net zero a tax break, I would have to read up on it before I could offer a position. But please send me your report. I'd be interested to take a look. The question about companies like Amazon, who talk a good game about being green companies, but sort of have a business model that is built on cardboard boxes and a pretty high carbon way of shopping generally, moving stuff around in boxes on trucks to people's houses. So it's really interesting what's been happening over the last few months with workers at these companies. It's been a real shift. There's Amazon Workers for Climate Justice group that I think 1,600 of them signed a petition. They brought it to shareholders, calling for Amazon to massively up its game when it comes to decarbonization. So I guess I don't put a lot of stock in what CEOs declare they're going to do. I've been around for a while. I've heard a lot of pledges. Remember when Richard Branson promised he was going to solve climate change at the Clinton Global Initiative and put all of his profits from all of his transportation companies into coming up with the solution to climate change? Have we heard anything about that lately? Anyway, I'm cynical about that, but I'm not cynical about workers' power. And for the first time, there was a job action at Amazon. I think more than 1,000 Amazon workers participated in the climate strike a few weeks ago. There was a good showing from Microsoft, good showing from Google. Google workers, and there's really interesting things going on in the tech sector with worker organizing right now. We've seen big walkouts, 20,000 workers at Google walking off the job, and it's connected to this, to demanding higher ethics from these companies, whether it's sexual harassment, whether it's not doing contracts with the military, not doing contracts with border agents and being part of the machinery of deportation. Once again, it's like an inside-outside pincer where you have university students saying we don't want these companies recruiting on our campuses if they're part of deportation and surveillance. But you also have workers. The hashtag is tech won't build it if you want to look into it. And there's just great stuff going on now, frankly, and they are pushing some more meaningful changes from these companies. So I'm not ready to say that Amazon is green, but after this, ahead of the climate strike, when it was clear that there was going to be this big walkout at Amazon, Bezos announced that he was buying 100,000 electric vehicle delivery for delivery, and that's a pretty substantial change. He also upped his targets and so on. It's not where they should be, and people walked out anyway because they weren't buying it. But it's something new to see that this level of tech worker organizing, and I'm excited about it. So
the Lucas plan, you in favour of what Steve was talking about?
That's brilliant. I mean, it's a really, really important labor history for us to know. And it's also important for us to remember, the next time there is, a factory being shut down, or dock workers losing their jobs, that there needs to be these types of collaborations.
And the just transition is absolutely central to this, if it's going to be genuinely a movement for everybody.
Exactly, and these workers should have before their machines are sold off and before all their assets go to auction, they should have a chance to develop a plan to turn their workplaces into green cooperatives. And if they've got a good plan, then it should be funded. And they need solidarity from academics who can help them come up with the plans. Where I've seen this happen, there's been wonderful collaborations with academia and workers. And the green movement needs to show up for these workers.
Yeah.
So, the bipartisanship question, I could go on for a long time, but I'm just going to try to be brief. So we can maybe one day, once again, get bipartisan support for a marginal carbon tax. But the problem is that this party has gone so far off the deep end and wasted so many years that the kind of policy that you could get bipartisan support for would be so very weak and inadequate considering how much we need to do in so short a time, that I think it's a waste of energy. I think what we need to do is build supermajorities and try to get real climate plans passed, Green New Deal, which will not get bipartisan support. And then we need to roll it out in communities and do what FDR did. And FDR was very, very smart when he rolled out the New Deal. He made sure, he looked at a map, he looked at the communities that voted Republican in 1933, and he put Green New Deal projects in those communities where they didn't support the Green New Deal. And they had jobs and they had services, and lo and behold, in 1936, many of them voted for him. And that's how you got bipartisan support, by actually creating jobs and showing people what it looks like on the ground.
And the Institute of Actuaries question about how do you motivate the older generation as well as the younger generation?
I'm glad you asked. This is a passion of mine because I actually think it's quite dangerous the way in which the climate crisis is being framed as a young people's issue. It is true that young people, that the younger you are, the longer you will live in a climate disrupted future, and the more climate disruption you will see if we do not change course. On the other hand, if we do change course, you could live in the beautiful future that we saw in that film or something like it. But if you actually look at the timelines for when this is really going to be hitting us, and we're already experiencing some major disruption, it is absolutely going to be in your lifetime and mine, and in the lifetime of those of middle-aged people. And what I say to them is, at least the young people will be able to run. I've tried this as a new motivating tactic. And I'm actually pretty serious, because if you look at who is most vulnerable to climate disruption, climate change exacerbates pre-existing vulnerabilities, right? So the people who are most vulnerable in disasters are the elderly, are the disabled, are people who are ill, who have mobility issues, and who need there to be some kind of infrastructure of care to help them. And this is no joke. And the idea that we just offload this onto young people is, it is, in my opinion, a moral atrocity, but it is also just for base self-interest, a very silly thing for middle-aged people to do.
Great. So I'm going to ask you a final question. This the conversation we've had today is going to go out on my podcast. This is a shameless plug for my podcast called Reasons to be Cheerful. Downloadable on all good platforms.
At least the young people will be able to run. Is that a reason to be cheerful?
Yeah. I want to give you the final word. Tell us a reason to be cheerful, but also, send this audience out to go and not just buy your book. They should all buy your book straight after this, but to go and do things. What message do you want to leave them with?
Well, I like the slogan of the UK climate strikers. They wrote a piece during ahead of the March 15th climate strikes. They said, Greta was the spark, but we are the wildfire. And I said before that if we want to win this epic battle, and it is a battle because we really are up against forces that are protecting a huge amount of capital then we really have to be on fire for it. It's going to take an extraordinary amount of energy and focus and determination. Young people right now are, as Greta said at the UN, giving up their childhoods to try to wake up the world. And so I think we all have to ask ourselves what we are willing to give up, what we're willing to really have that kind of focus for. And so I guess my reason to be cheerful is that there's a huge generational shift going on right now. And I think that our generation, we grew up in the grips of neoliberalism's war on the imagination, right? Whether or not we were Thatcherite, we still absorbed this idea that there is no alternative, that we had reached the end of the history, that there was nothing but this, there was no escape from this bleak reality. Anything we tried to do would be worse. And we really got the hard sell, But I think that people who have come of age in the aftermath of the 2008 financial crisis, when the neoliberal project has been in ideological retreat, if not in retreat with policies. The policies are still there, but the hard sell isn't there. So we now have a lot of young people who never got the memo that history was over, who never were told that they weren't supposed to dream or that there is no alternative, and are daring to have those dreams and to have that vision of a future that doesn't look like every Cli-Fi movie we've ever seen. So I think for me, that's a huge reason to be cheerful. I've never seen anything like it in my lifetime, and I believe in it. We've got a chance.